but he's out of a job.
That's true, but he has his life.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm just saying, there's an awful lot of needs involved.
Yes, there are. Yeah. A lot of children who don't have moms and dads this morning.
Yeah, there are an awful lot of needs involved. The school systems are closed throughout the area. They're saying
the subway system's still closed?
No, the subway systems are operating.
Bridges and tunnels, I think, are open in New York.
Right.
That's right.
To limited passage in the city, into the city. Going out you can.
Correct.
Limited passage back into the city. Did you have much of a chore getting in this morning?
I didn't. I had a great driver who was there and ready to go.
Yeah, there was some difficulty evidently in a lot of the people getting into the city, people that normally help us get to work.
He couldn't go out of the city last night, so he spent the night in the city.
Oh, is that right?
So that he would be ready and able to take us this morning.
Yeah, yeah. So. This is a heck of a chore. Can we shoot the scenes outside once again, Don? Take a look at the scene out there. Look at this. This is 59th and 5th Avenue. That is a place right now around noontime, a source of great congestion, great noise, a lot of horn honking, and instead, look at that.
Streets are empty and the sidewalks are empty, but I got to tell you, outside our studio yesterday, as I was walking around, filled with people gathering around monitors. There's yesterday.
Yeah.
People just waiting for any bit of news.
Well, it's going to be continuing today because when we step aside, Dan Rather is going to step in and be continuing with complete CBS News coverage of Attack on America. And of course, we'll be back here tomorrow morning, and I guess we needn't tell you what we'll be doing then. We'll be trying to bring it up to speed, and hopefully then we'll have some more numbers and hopefully some more lives that are pulled out of the rubble.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
That would be good news.
That does it for us on this day. Dan Rather is next.
The building shook so violently there was no question that a bomb had exploded. At least that's what we were thinking.
A first-hand account on the most horrific terrorist act in American history. It's gripping eyewitness news testimony you'll only hear here on Eyewitness News.
And just when you think you can't be shocked any further, new video of the second plane hitting the Second World Trade Center that leaves you speechless.
I'm Kai Jackson, live at the Pentagon just outside of Washington, where a 757 slammed into the west side of this building. I'll have more on recovery efforts coming up.
Here at BWI Airports, still shut down for the first time in national history. Join us to find out when and what time this airport will reopen.
Eyewitness News coverage begins right here.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sally Thorner.
And I'm Don Scott. Here's what people are still talking about today. A day after the most horrific act of terrorism ever to take place on U.S. soil, Americans are united in their shock and outrage. Our Eyewitness News team coverage begins this noon with Tim Williams, who's standing by live with the very latest for us. Good afternoon, Tim.
Good afternoon, Don. You know, while the hunt for the terrorists behind this deadly attack intensifies, today workers continue to sift through the remains of the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in the nation's capital. Meanwhile, as Terry Okita reports, the nation tries to recover.
While the remains of New York's World Trade Center still smolder, search teams are finding people alive in the rubble. As many as 10 rescue workers buried when the buildings crumbled have been found.
They are risking their lives to try to save their friends and their colleagues and the New Yorkers who are still trapped.
Where they believe that the victims are going to be is so far into the scene, and the rubble is so deep. I mean, you're walking through rubble that's waist deep.
But no one is giving up hope. Volunteers are still flooding to the scene and to area hospitals.
Hopefully save some lives and help to send some people home.
But sadly, hundreds of people are still missing and thousands are feared dead from this terrorist attack. 2 giant skyscrapers demolished in a matter of hours after suicide hijackers somehow managed to fly 2 jets directly into the towers.
Oh my God!
So far, more than 100 dump trucks full of debris from the fallen buildings have been hauled out of New York. And while rescue teams continue to look for survivors, they're also looking for clues that could help bring the terrorists to justice, specifically the black boxes from the downed airplanes.
That's what they look like, except it'll be obviously covered with soot and dirt.
That was Terry Okita reporting. We will have more from a terrorist expert coming up a little bit later in this noon broadcast. Don?
All right, thank you very much, Tim. We're beginning to get a list of some of the victims from yesterday's terrorist attack. The plane that crashed into the Pentagon was Flight 77 from Washington Dulles to Los Angeles. Supposed to go to Los Angeles. At least 5 Marylanders were killed on that flight. One was one of the flight attendants, Michelle Heidenberger from Chevy Chase. Among the passengers killed on that flight, 45-year-old Charles Falkenberg from University Park, and his wife, 45-year-old Leslie Whittington. Their 2 daughters, 8-year-old Zoe and 3-year-old Dana, were also on board. The family planned to spend 2 months in Australia.
There's no way to know how many people are affected by the shutdown of America's airports. All airplanes have been grounded since shortly after yesterday's attacks. Our Eyewitness News team coverage continues now, live in Anne Arundel County near BWI Airport this noon with Yakenda McGahey on the latest about the nation's air travel. Yakenda?
Hi, Sally. The Federal Aviation Administration reportedly gave the okay for air traffic to resume at noon, which was just a few minutes ago, but they're reportedly allowing individual airlines to make a decision as to when they'll put their aircrafts into the air. So, for instance, Delta Airlines says none of its aircrafts will be airborne until at least 6 o'clock this evening. So we wait for word from BWI as to when flights will resume today.
This morning, BWI remained closed. We will have another update at 1 o'clock this afternoon. We are at the MAA, airport officials, the airlines and the FAA are currently working to go over new security procedures.
This plane departed from BWI. The Maryland Aviation Administration says it's the Department of Defense carrying a search and rescue team to an unknown location. Once BWI is open, we understand that there will be a heightened state of security. All passengers are asked to arrive about 2 hours early. Parking or standing on the upper and lower level of the road is strictly prohibited and strictly enforced. Furthermore, it will take some time for airlines to resume their normal flight operation. So you're asked to call your individual airline about your specific flight schedule early. And you're asked, please do not come out here until a formal announcement is made. If you do come out here, this is what you're going to see. Authorities out here sending you back the way you came. Back to you on Television Hill.
Yakenda, thank you. Eyewitness News live at BWI Airport. Here's some useful information about the 4 planes that went down yesterday. American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles. American Airlines Flight 77 from Dulles to Los Angeles. United Airlines Flight 175 from Boston to Los Angeles, and United Airlines Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco. If you need to check on any passengers, you can call these numbers. American Airlines 1-800-245-0999 and United Airlines 1-800-932-8555. Eyewitness News will update you as soon as we hear when the BWI Airport will reopen for business.
Airports may be closed, but the Pentagon is open. The building may be crippled and parts are still on fire, but civilian and military personnel reported back to work this morning. Eyewitness News is live outside the Pentagon. That's where Kai Jackson continues our team coverage this noon. Good afternoon, Kai.
Good afternoon, Don. The Pentagon is indeed open today. There is evidence of that all around this facility of the military. That includes military as well as civilian personnel who are back at work today. Again, a show that the United States is not going to be shut down. The process of searching for survivors and for recovering bodies will be a very slow and a very painstaking process, according to authorities who we spoke with today. Fire continued to burn and smoke billow from the west side of the Pentagon some 24 hours after a 757 slammed into the building in an act of terrorism. Military helicopters have been buzzing around the headquarters of the country's defense all day. For quite some time, FBI agents combed the grounds near the media staging area looking for something, although we're not exactly certain what they were looking for. At this hour, fire officials tell Eyewitness News that wood inside of the Pentagon is what continues to burn, not jet fuel, but jet fuel is hampering efforts of dogs to sniff out survivors and victims. Rescue workers, particularly Battalion Chief Mike Tamelo from the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue Department, tell Eyewitness News that this attack is similar to the attack in Oklahoma City, and they have a lot of work to do.
putting rescuers into these areas that could potentially collapse is extremely hazardous, as all these, earthquake or whatever. So that's why we have to come in with cranes and heavy equipment, and in a controlled process, disassemble the building.
Chief, can you tell us about some of the specialized units that are there and where they're from around the country?
Right now for the Pentagon, Fairfax County was working all last night. Task forces from Montgomery County and Virginia Beach are operating right now, and we expect the task force from Tennessee to arrive probably late afternoon.
Don, over my shoulder are cranes. Those cranes will begin a very slow, delicate, and dangerous process of trying to lift out levels of the Pentagon. The Pentagon is constructed in several layers. They start from A and go through E, we're told, about 5 sections, and they will delicately try to remove some of those sections so that they can go in. Until they are able to remove some of those sections, it is extremely dangerous for workers to go in there. That part of the building, that part of the complex is very unstable, very unsecure. We also had an opportunity to talk with the Red Cross this afternoon. They told us that about 23,000 people nationwide are spread out, including Pittsburgh, including New York, and including this Pentagon area, where they're providing food, providing relief to those who are working feverishly to try and recover any survivors, if there are any indeed. Right now, back to you on TV Hill. Don?
All right, even that number is astounding this noon. Thank you very much, Kai Jackson. Eyewitness News live outside the Pentagon. From the State Department today, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell says, while no military response is imminent, the U.S. does consider this an act of war.
The American people know what they saw yesterday, and what they believe they saw clearly was an act of war, not only against America, but against the international community, the community of peace. But they didn't hurt our spirit. They didn't hurt our resilience as a society. And we'll come back firmly. We are still very much intact as a society, as a nation, and we know how to respond.
Now to recap the latest developments on the attack on America. The FBI has received 700 leads in the investigation of yesterday's terrorist attacks, but so far no arrests have been made anywhere. BWI is closed indefinitely, the airport of course. And Secretary of State Powell says this is war, not just against the United States, but against civilization. And he reinforced President Bush's assertion that the deadly attacks would be avenged.
Among the horror that America has witnessed, there are also some miracles. One of them visited us on TV Hill this morning. His name is Steve Peck, and the Timonium man was inside the World Trade Center when the plane hit yesterday. He joined us live on the Morning Edition and told his story to Tim Williams.
First of all, I had no desire to look back at what was going on. There's a lot of people trying to see and witness the event. I looked back so I could take a mental photo of what those buildings looked like, and then I didn't look back again. We just kept going north. Police wanted everybody out of there, and it was so crowded they were just there. So went up Broadway, and we're about 10 blocks north when the first building collapsed, and the plume of smoke was incredible. I could look back on Broadway and just see this violent plume of smoke racing up. We ran as fast as we could, and I got about 3 blocks and looked over, and thousands of people running. There was a cab that didn't have anybody in it. And I said, are you in service? He goes, yeah, where do you want to go? I was like, north.
That was Tim Williams talking to Timonium's Steve Peck. Some other survivors have a tourist to thank. A visiting doctor was in Lower Manhattan at the time of this tragic attack. Take a look at this home video from Dr. Mark Heath as he keeps his camera rolling while one of the Twin Towers collapses to the ground.
I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car. It's incredible. There's all these noises. I don't know what it is. They say someone needs help.
Yeah, Mike! Mike! Mike, come over here! Yeah!
Anybody need a doctor?
Where are you?
Oxygen. Don't have oxygen.
Hello, Doc.
Hey, that guy needs some oxygen if someone can share it with him.
10-4.
Thanks.
That's just a portion of the video Dr. Mark Heath shot yesterday. We should note he continued to help victims while keeping his camera running the whole time.
Amazing. Financial markets in the U.S. are not running today, but foreign markets are open and reacting to our terrorist attack. Japan's stock market opened this morning and took a steep dive as traders sold off stocks in companies with global operations. European stock markets have also been mixed but calm. Federal officials will decide later today whether trading will resume on American markets tomorrow. Across this country and across the world, the attack on America is the only thing people are talking about. Tom Fenton continues our team coverage from overseas.
There's only one story this morning, only one image. Reflecting the stunned incomprehension, commuters gazed at TV screens as the scenes were carried round the world. Some of it turned into hysteria. But there were measured tones from the BBC.
Doomsday in Manhattan, a terrorist apocalypse.
World leaders were steadfast in their support. Germany's Gerhard Schröder said the attacks were a declaration of war. Cuban President Fidel Castro, an old enemy of the United States, expressed his solidarity and condolences. Britain's leader was all-embracing.
This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism.
But the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which harbors the chief suspect, Osama bin Laden, rushed to deny that he could have had anything to do with it. The Taliban ambassador to Pakistan warned that it would be a great mistake for America to retaliate before completing an investigation.
There have been a number of bomb scares overseas. The world's tallest building in Kuala Lumpur was temporarily evacuated, and so was a skyscraper in Frankfurt. The American armed forces around the world are on the highest state of alert, and the question in everybody's minds is, how will the United States government now react? Tom Fenton, CBS News, London.
And more from Washington. While most of us were sleeping, Secretary of State Powell was telephoning world leaders in search of support for an eventual coordinated response to the assault against the United States.
While most world leaders are condemning the attack against America, some Palestinians in the West Bank are celebrating. This is the scene at the Damascus Gate to the Old City following the attacks on the Trade Center and Pentagon. Palestinian men, women, and children chanted in jubilation, cheering on the terrorists. Here in America, there's a fear of a backlash against Arabs living here. For more on that story, we go live to our Eyewitness Newsroom where Tim Williams has the latest on that. Tim?
Well, Sally, I'm joined by Dr. Jeffrey Ian Ross. He's a criminologist and terrorism expert from the University of Baltimore, and he joins us now this noon. First off, thank you for joining us this noon. It's been a busy day, and your expertise is certainly coming in handy for a lot of folks, so thank you for being here. Tell us, Doctor, what do you think? We hear a lot about Osama bin Laden. Without speculation, which I know you don't want to do, on whether or not he did it, do you think he's capable of such horrendous crimes and acts of terrorism?
From what we know from media reports, from listening to authorities like the FBI, national security agencies, it does appear that his organization has the resources, the personnel, the training, and a history that could be capable of something like that. But I think it's really important to reserve judgment until a majority of the evidence is in, and that people who have the expertise to make those sorts of decisions can almost without certainty be on a shed of doubt point the finger at him and or his organization. I guess another thing too is I'm really worried about overreaction or backlash against individuals, organizations, particular nationalities, who feel a loss or fear, want to attack or cast blame at. I think now's a time for to assess exactly what where we are right now, and to pay our respects to the dead and pay our condolences to the people who've had family who are missing right now. It's a time to give blood. It's a time to generally comfort loved ones and think how appreciative we are that we were not somehow involved.
Okay. Now, you mentioned backlash. Are you fearful that we could start to see little pockets of backlash here in this country, in this community here? How do we guard against, as you said, the overreaction?
Well, number one is admitting that it has taken place in the past. Secondly, accepting the fact that it may take place in the future. I think many law enforcement agencies, particularly municipal police, in communities, in cities, towns that have communities, particularly those that come from the Middle East, are very sensitive about possible attacks against them as a form of retribution, and they are providing some sort of protection, steeped up protection. There's increased protection not only amongst mosques or against mosques from possible attack, but also synagogues, churches, etc. So I think now is a time of vigilance, but it's also a time for sort of just consolidation and reflection and thankfulness.
Okay. Now, we talked just briefly before coming on air about cause and effect.
Right.
What this may cause, what these acts of terrorism may cause, and you know, as a retribution maybe, but also what may have caused these acts. Back us up a little bit. Tell us what could have triggered these types of attacks against the United States.
Well, I think the fact that there was a bombing of the World Trade Center almost 5 years ago, and it was not successful in the amount of damage that it did in terms of toppling the building, served as a sort of a challenge for some individuals. They recognized and probably studied the effect of the bombing, and they knew if they were going to do a bombing that would have a bigger impact, more people watching, it would have to be of a spectacular nature of the kind it was yesterday. So I think it was very well planned and orchestrated, and everyone who was engaged in the planning of the attack knew exactly where, when, and how they needed to attack that building so that it would have the consequent worldwide attention, if not the effect of toppling the entire buildings, and also the Pentagon, too. And I'm sure that it was a phenomenal amount of training that went on. People who are doing this are professionals in the sense that they're well trained and financed in order to carry out an attack or attacks of this magnitude. And I'm not surprised, I wouldn't be surprised if there were similar acts that were planned yesterday that were aborted either by the hijackers or that they have been intercepted. The individuals have been intercepted right now by the authorities, and we just don't know about them right now. It just so happens in the eyes of the terrorists or the hijackers that these ones were successful, so maybe they cut their losses and said, hey, listen, we got 4 done. It's time to call it a day, and we'll be back.
Okay, before we let you go, of course, symbolism was a large part of what we found out now, that one plane was actually headed to the White House, but then, in fact, may have ended up at the Pentagon. One may have gone to Camp David. But we talk about the Twin Towers, you know, a sign of American capitalism, the highest standing buildings in New York City. Do we then rebuild them bigger, you know, in the face of terrorists and say, hey, look, you can't stop us? Or do you say, maybe this is a wake-up call, we're not going to build these things because it'll just tempt someone, maybe challenge someone to come and do the same thing again?
That's an excellent question. Or do we do something like they've done in Oklahoma City and build a memorial to the victims of this attack? Certainly the World Trade Towers is a symbol of American financial strength, the ability to make a phenomenal structure. There are other buildings and structures that are symbols of America, both accepted in the United States and abroad. I think that the larger the building, the more vulnerable it is for attack. I think what the hijackers knew somewhere in the back of their mind was, you know, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And this certainly had that impact.
Okay. Dr. Jeffrey Ian, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Dr. Ross, thank you, and we'll talk to you again.
Great.
All right, guys, back to you in the studio.
Thank you very much, Tim. All sorts of tensions continue to run high throughout this country and in this area, and many people are seeking counseling from their religious advisors in this very true hour of need. And Pat Warren is standing by live to continue our Eyewitness News team coverage with words from one of Baltimore's leading religious figures. Good afternoon, Pat.
Good afternoon, Don. And yes, an interfaith service is planned for tomorrow, but today Cardinal William Keeler is telling Eyewitness News that people should be cautious about not placing blame.
That is in our fundamental documents, which we see as really basic. There's a call to nonviolence, a call for working for peace and reconciliation among peoples. So whether you're Jewish or Christian or Muslim, this is part of the foundational documents which we see as our word of God to guide us.
So we should not be lashing out at people because of their religion?
It would be a real mistake to single out any religious group in particular. At this time, when already, and I've read a number of statements this morning, for example, from Muslim leaders, absolutely deploring what happened yesterday, recognizing how insane and irrational the action was.
Do you believe all religious groups are invited, in fact, to tomorrow's interfaith service that will be held here at the Basilica at 5? Back to you, Don.
All right, thank you very much. Eyewitness News live downtown outside the Basilica of the Assumption with Pat Warren, who has been covering a widely divergent aspect of this for us this morning. She was at the Maryland Emergency Management Agency talking to that authority, and of course this noontime talking to another authority, also the Baltimore-based NAACP, is calling for international days of prayer for peace and unity everywhere.
For many of us, prayer is bringing the only comfort from yesterday's devastating events. Last night, many people in our area went to prayer vigils. Dennis Edwards continues our team coverage.
The focus of the night is to call people back to God. When something this traumatic happens, you need a big shoulder to lean on. And the biggest shoulder to lean on, cry on, and be held by is God's.
Someone once wrote, "It's not what happens in life that counts most. It's who you turn to in times of trouble."
Right now, I'm just praying for those who had their lives lost. It's a terrible thing that's taking place today.
Tonight, more than 3,000 worshipers from New Psalmist Baptist Church and 5 other congregations look to heaven. They anticipate help coping with an unthinkable tragedy here on earth.
This is a dark day. And in the midst of pain, there is but one painkiller.
Victims are also remembered here at Temple Oheb Shalom, but members also prayed that the government find those responsible and a way to protect the public. Here the prayers are for protection and deliverance, for some sense of relief from deep feelings of emptiness and sorrow.
To help us find a way to heal ourselves in our emptiness, and then pray for all the people who've lost their lives today.
New Psalmist Pastor Dr. Walter Scott Thomas sees a mission in all this misery.
It makes us aware that we as a nation have an awesome job to do to kind of rid the world of that kind of pain. Not those kind of people, but that kind of pain.
Dennis Edwards, WJZ Eyewitness News.
Eyewitness News counted 24 prayer vigils held last night in our area.
And those vigils will continue this evening as well. St. Michael's in Overlea will hold a service at 7 this evening. United Evangelical Church on East Avenue and Dillon Street will have a prayer service also at 7 o'clock. At 7:30, the Gospel Tabernacle in Perry Hall will have a service, and the pastor is offering free counseling to anyone who comes. And now we're going to switch it over to Tim Williams, who's going to take a brief look at the weather for us this noontime. Tim?
Well, certainly, Don and Sally, as we mentioned earlier today, with the gloomy gray mood, certainly the bright spot in your day could be the weather. We have a fantastic day out, blue skies, lots of sunshine. Here's how it shapes up from the First Warning Weather Center. This is what we're looking at. Sunshine today, very clear, mild, low humidity, although we're at 73 degrees right now here on TV Hill. We're looking for 82 as a high before this day is out. 62 degrees overnight, clear, cool, very comfortable. Even look for the possibility of low 50s in the north and west suburbs. Tomorrow, however, the sun starts to fade. We look for some scattered showers as clouds increase toward the evening hours. Look for the possibility of some late thunderstorms. 82 degrees tomorrow, 58 overnight. And then your 5-day forecast, temperatures right around the 70-degree mark by mid-weekend, down to the mid-50s overnight. A lot of sun in the forecast. We'll keep, of course, completely update you on the first warning forecast throughout the rest of the evening. Don?
All right. Of course, we urge you to stay tuned to Eyewitness News for continuing coverage of America Under Attack. Some unbelievable video coming out of New York this morning that captures the first plane barreling into the World Trade Center, taken yesterday but available this morning. When we show it to you, you will see how calm the streets were before the unthinkable happened. There was some sort of fire or accident. A fire crew was there. Suddenly, the photographer's attention is drawn to the sky by the noise of the plane going overhead, a plane flying abnormally low, and then he pans up. It's one of the flights from Boston, and it smashes right in to the North Tower and explodes into a ball of fire. Again, this is the first plane crash. Once again, we'd like to recap the latest developments in this attack on America and our continuing coverage of it. The FBI says it has received over 700 leads in its investigation of yesterday's terrorist attack, but so far no arrests have been made anywhere. BWI Airport remains closed and will remain closed indefinitely, says the FAA. And Secretary of State Colin Powell says this is war, not just against the United States, but against civilization. And he reinforced President Bush's assertion that the deadly attacks would be avenged. All right, many people are furiously dialing their phones, trying to reach loved ones who are traveling or working in the affected cities, of course. But Maryland State Police are asking you this noon to not use your cell phone to call them. Local and national law enforcement and rescue agencies still need all the cell towers and the airwaves so that they can communicate with each other.
But those cell towers were the only link to friends and family for the passengers on the hijacked planes. One of those calls came from Mark Bingham, who was on board that ill-fated United Airlines flight that went down outside Pittsburgh. His mother describes that call.
He said to me, "Mom, this is Mark Bingham." As if I wouldn't know who it was. And he said, "I want to let you know that I love you." And I think he may have said, "I love you guys," meaning everybody in the family, I guess. And I'm on a flight from Newark to San Francisco, and there are 3 guys that have taken over the plane, and they say they have a bomb. And I said, "Mark, who are they?" I said, "Mark, I love you too." And I said, "Who are these guys?" And then he seemed to be pulled away from the phone for a minute. And he came back on and said, "It's true," as if he was trying to convince me that what he was saying was true. And I said, "I believe you." Who are they? And he seemed pretty distracted, as if someone was pulling him away from the phone or something. There was something, and then the phone went dead. During the course of the conversation, he did say that he was not, he said that he was calling me from the air phone.
Another cell phone call from that same flight led investigators to believe that the plane was headed toward Camp David here in Maryland. Marylanders on board the USNS Comfort are awaiting orders to help in this tragedy. Eyewitness News Live now at the Baltimore Harbor, where Alex Dimitrick has the very latest. Hi, Alex.
Sally, good afternoon. The Navy hospital ship Comfort was expected to set sail for New York this morning. It is still here on what the Navy calls a 6-hour tether. Now, what that means is that it could still sail, but right now it is on standby. But ship and crew are ready to help.
150 doctors, nurses, medical technicians, and supplies needed to get the Navy's hospital ship up and running arrived in Baltimore just after dawn.
Okay, hold up right here.
The heart of the Comfort, ready to go to New York.
Help the overflow of the hospitals up in New York. Anything we can do to assist them up there.
This is a day that I will never forget, or a time in my life that I will never forget.
The military side of the ship comes from the Naval Hospital in Bethesda, but the sailors that actually run the Comfort are civilian.
On the navigational chart for New York Harbor, and it actually has the World Trade Center building, the north and the south. They're actually navigational aids, and it was just a little mind-boggling that they're not there anymore, and I've used those for navigational aids for years, and now they're no longer there.
A converted supertanker, it houses enough emergency rooms and operating rooms to fill a 1,000-bed hospital.
We're prepared. The Navy's prepared. We've been called to do a duty, and we're going to do that. We're going to fulfill that duty. That's what we're here for.
Again, the Comfort and her crew are on a 6-hour standby while it's determined if it's actually going to be needed in New York. Now, with the injured already being treated, unless more and larger numbers of seriously injured survivors are found, the Navy may well decide to keep the Comfort right here in Baltimore. We should know one way or the other, Don, by this afternoon. Back to you.
Thanks, Alex.
Sally,
Alex Dimitri. That's okay. Alex live in Baltimore. Emergency medical technicians and volunteers rushed to the scene at the World Trade Center yesterday to help the injured. Eyewitness News Health Watch reporter Kelly Lynn has more on the triage efforts of hundreds of emergency workers. Kelly?
Sally, hundreds of people poured out of the two buildings shortly after the attacks yesterday. Emergency workers were bussed into the city from all over the Northeast to assist local authorities and hospitals. New York City hospitals have treated more than 1,400 people, and they say that they are inundated with more patients than they can handle. And because of that, multiple triage centers have been set up in New York and New Jersey. New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani says that 1,500 of the walking wounded were evacuated to Liberty State Park, the location of the Statue of Liberty, where they were treated. Authorities say that it will take days, even weeks, before we know how many people died in the rubble of the Twin Towers. Sally?
Okay, thanks a lot, Kelly, for that live report. Emergency workers and EMTs from all over the country are volunteering their services to help aid the victims.
We're once going to go back south, just south of the Potomac River in Arlington, Virginia, where Kai Jackson is standing by live at the Pentagon to update us on the situation there. Once again, good afternoon, Kai.
Yeah, Don, it's still an incredible scene out here. As we mentioned to you earlier at the beginning of the newscast for noon, you see these cranes in the distance. What those cranes are going to do, they are going to try to surgically remove, very slowly, some of the debris that's sitting and piled on top of itself. It's very similar to the scene we saw in Oklahoma City in 1995. But the difference here is it is scattered with jet fuel. So that's presenting one of the dangers. The other problem is if they go in too quickly, this could pose a hazard to those rescue workers who are trying to get in. So the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue Department, along with a number of search and rescue teams from across the country, are trying to get in there, but they have to do it in a very slow, a very precisioned, and a very delicate manner. We have seen helicopter movement, military helicopter movement, in and around the Pentagon all day, but we can't overemphasize enough the fact that the Pentagon is open for business. A few minutes ago, I spied, and I think they've moved off now, we had FBI agents covering the grounds looking for some type of clues, I guess, from the crash of the 757 that went into the side of the building. But there were also a number of authorities on top of the Pentagon building. They were walking around, probably looking for anything that might aid them in trying to put together what happened once this plane went into the west side of the Pentagon building. Don?
All right. Thank you very much, Kai Jackson, once again keeping us up to date live from Arlington, Virginia, the Pentagon. All right, needless to say, the terrorism here has made headlines, in most cases, huge headlines today, all across the country and around the world, really. Many chose one word, and the biggest banner type anyone had seen in years. War predominated around the world, and hell was another one-word headline used. Armageddon was another. You see these others. The story dominated television networks the world over as well. Finland had wall-to-wall coverage, Bangladesh too, and in the Far Eastern countries where cable screens now resemble Western ones. We didn't get a chance to show you the Far Eastern cable, but it was coming up there. We have had these headlines for you today. In case you haven't seen the local paper, the Sun Papers also chose one-word headline, devastation, following up with several smaller headlines in the word, thousands are feared dead. USA Today, 3 words, act of war. Says it all, and of course the picture says, what do they say, 1,000 words?
Right.
And the next paper, the Washington Post, the most words we've seen today on any paper in this area, the ones we look at. Terrorists hijack 4 airlines, destroy World Trade Center, hit Pentagon, and of course, hundreds dead. We all assume that will be moved to thousands. And one more paper to show you, a vertical tabloid, the New York Post. On the cover, they have act of war. The World Trade Center destroyed, many dead. They don't mention the Pentagon. And usually where they have a sports headline in the back, they have no headline at all, but just this moving picture from the streets of New York around the World Trade Center with yesterday's dates. An amazing situation to see how words and pictures combine. All right, we have had more than 24 hours now to try to come to grips with the terrorism that hit America yesterday, but it's still difficult to believe what has happened.
Oh my God, another plane has just hit another building.
Terror and chaos began when 4 regularly scheduled flights from Washington's Dulles Airport, Newark Airport in New Jersey, and Boston's Logan Airport took off, loaded with fuel, all headed for West Coast destinations, Los Angeles and San Francisco. At 8:52, the first flight, American Flight 11, crashes into the World Trade Center's 110-story North Tower. At 9:03, a second plane crashes into the South Tower. And at 9:40, another plane from Dulles, bound for Los Angeles, flies into the Pentagon. And about 20 minutes later, a fourth plane crashes near Pittsburgh. In all, 266 people and crew members on board. The 4 planes have died, but that death toll is expected to rise and rise dramatically. As we said, it's hard to believe that someone could fathom taking advantage of a situation like this, like the one that America is facing right now, but it's apparently happening as gas stations around the country do. In the hours after the attack, some gasoline stations jacked up their prices to more than $6 a gallon, we have heard. For more on this story, we once again go live to the Eyewitness Newsroom, where Vic Carter has the very latest. Good afternoon, Vic.
Hi, Don. It is hard to believe that this happens, and it does happen. We do stories on it all the time after tragedies, after situations when we have hurricanes. We have had hardware stores raise the price of plywood, and now here in the wake of this horrible tragedy that has affected the entire United States, in the middle of America, the price of gasoline is going way up, as if it needed to do that anyway. Myra Weeman is here with us now. We understand that Myra was with AAA, that over the past 24 hours, we have seen just some incredible things, including the fact that in the Midwest, price of gasoline gone up as much as $5 or $6 a gallon.
That's right. There are, though, some isolated examples of this. This is not widespread. They are very isolated. In Indiana, we have seen some stations that AAA officials have been able to go to the station and visibly see that, yes, they have raised the prices almost to $6.50 per gallon more than they were the day before.
Did any of these vendors happen to give a reason for raising the price?
Most of the vendors are claiming that the suppliers are telling them that they don't know when the next truck's going to come in or what the price of that truck is. However, the big oil companies, Exxon, Amoco, BP, Mobil, they are all claiming that they have put the word out to urge gas station owners to keep the prices stable.
We also understand that even during our gas crisis recently, the price of gasoline going up, that profits for these companies continue to go up as well. They made a lot of money, and I guess at this point there are some vendors who are thinking that they can do that again.
That's right, and although the reports from the oil companies are saying that no, they're not telling station owners to raise the prices, the station owners are doing this on their own, and AAA is urging these station owners not to take advantage of the American public right now.
But as you point out, it's pretty much in the Midwest. What about here at home? Has it gone up at all?
We have not been able to verify any reports here in the Baltimore metropolitan area, and no, our prices are remaining stable. We are still under $1.45 an average per gallon here in the Baltimore metro area.
Okay, and you expect it to stay that way for a while?
We do expect it to stay the same as long as all issues on the home front stay the same.
Okay, Myra, thank you very much for joining us. This is a story, of course, we will continue to follow, and we'll be checking around the country to see how gas prices are going up, going down, and of course we'll be checking on gas prices right here. Back to you, Don.
All right, thank you very much, Myra and Vic, again in the Eyewitness Newsroom.
Airport officials originally thought BWI would be open by now, but it's still closed. Let's go back to Anne Arundel County, where Yakenda McGahey is live near BWI. Yakenda, what's the latest?
Sally, we're scheduled for an update around 1 o'clock this afternoon with BWI for them to tell us when and what time they decide to open this airport and if they're going to do it, in fact, today. Now, you must know that the Federal Aviation Administration has given the okay for air travel reportedly to resume. However, they're leaving it up to individual airlines and individual airports as to when they'll allow aircraft to fly in the air again. Understand when BWI reopens, there are a set of few rules that will be in place. There will be a heightened state of security. All passengers are asked to arrive 2 hours early. Parking or standing in the upper and lower level decks is strictly prohibited and will be strictly enforced. In other words, you will be towed. Furthermore, it is going to take some time for individual airlines to resume their normal flight operations, so they are asking you to call your individual airline and ask about your specific flight reservations. Again, we still do not know what time BWI Airport will open, but we are scheduled to get an update at 1 o'clock this afternoon. Back to you on television.
Okay, thanks, Yakenda, for that live report from the airport. We now go live to Kai Jackson at the Pentagon. Kai, what are you hearing down there?
Sally, I won't call it chaotic, but it's still very busy down here. Rescue workers have a great task in front of them today, but there's some glimmers of hope throughout something that's a very tragic situation. We spied, and I'm just going to point it out to you, we can't really zoom in at this point, there's a flag that's perched atop all of the charred, damaged, and debris west side of the Pentagon building. And it's another testament to the American spirit. Although the World Trade Centers were brought down, although this building was heavily damaged, and although a plane went down in Pittsburgh, the American spirit continues to fly. And that's what's happening right here with this flag. I took a closer look with some binoculars at that section of the building, Sally, a few minutes ago. It is like a house of cards, almost a domino effect. Slabs of floor and wall are kind of pancaked on top of each other. And again, it goes back to Fairfax County Fire and Rescue officials telling us that they have to be very careful as they try to remove sections of that with a crane, because they don't want their workers getting injured in the process of trying to either recover survivors or recover bodies. So again, the work is going to be immense out here. As we mentioned earlier, there have been helicopters flying in and around this area throughout most of the morning. They continue to do so. And there is a high security presence in and around Washington, D.C. Of course, we're in Arlington, Virginia, just south of D.C., but you can't even get anywhere near this area unless you have some media credentials or some type of identification stating why you need to be here. Sally?
Kai, reports are coming into the Eyewitness newsroom that many Pentagon employees are being evacuated because of so much smoke in the building. Are you seeing any evidence of that?
I haven't seen that. What I'll do is I will try and talk with someone from the Pentagon. We have had some authorities out here with Fairfax County Fire and Rescue. There have been some Pentagon authorities out here. I'll try and find them and try and get an answer about that question to you.
Okay, we'll check back with you.
What I can tell you, though, is, okay, what I can tell you quickly is there was a great deal of smoke out here most of the morning, and when the wind shifted, it blanketed this media staging area. Sally, there are probably about, and I'm not exaggerating, in excess of 200 media cameras out here. Sure. Local media, international media, just staging all around this entire area. But as soon as I can find an answer to that question, we'll get it to you.
Thank you very much, Kai Jackson. We'll check in with you live from the Pentagon in a little bit.
Of course, truth be told, the Pentagon is really a five-sided building, and it has 5 separate entrances, and where Kai is, he can't see any more than 3. Right. And one of them is damaged. Rescue workers continue to dig for bodies in the World Trade Center's rubble. Ferries and vans are now transporting the dead to a military terminal in New Jersey. The final death toll may not be known for weeks. It's estimated that more than 300 firefighters have lost their lives. Dozens of police officers are also missing, and most of the victims remained buried in that rubble. Gretchen Carlson has the latest for us. Sorry.
While the remains of New York's World Trade Center still smolder, search teams are finding people alive in the rubble. As many as 10 rescue workers buried when the buildings crumbled have been found.
They are risking their lives to try to save their friends and their colleagues and the New Yorkers who are still trapped.
Where they believe that the victims are going to be is so far into the scene, and the rubble is so deep. I mean, you're walking through rubble that's waist deep.
But no one is giving up hope. Volunteers are still flooding to the scene and to area hospitals.
Hopefully save some lives and help to send some people home.
But sadly, hundreds of people are still missing and thousands are feared dead from this terrorist attack. 2 giant skyscrapers demolished in a matter of hours after suicide hijackers somehow managed to fly 2 jets directly into the towers.
Oh my God!
So far, more than 100 dump trucks full of debris from the fallen buildings have been hauled out of New York. And while rescue teams continue to look for survivors, they're also looking for clues that could help bring the terrorists to justice, specifically the black boxes from the downed airplanes.
That's what they look like, except it'll be obviously covered with soot and dirt.
Gretchen Carlson, CBS News, New York.
And Eyewitness News is just beginning to get a list of some more of the victims from yesterday's terrorist attack. The plane that crashed into the Pentagon was American Airlines Flight 77 from Washington Dulles headed for Los Angeles. At least 5 Marylanders or area people were killed on that flight. One was a flight attendant, identified to us as Michelle Heidenberger from Chevy Chase, Maryland. Among the passengers killed, 45-year-old Charles Falkenberg from University Park, which is near Georgetown. Also his 45-year-old wife, Leslie Whittington. She's a professor at Georgetown. Their 2 daughters, 8-year-old Zoe and 3-year-old Dana, were also on board the flight. The family, we are told, was planning to spend the next 2 months in Australia. Those are the names, the local names we have so far. When all this is over, the death toll is still feared to be in the tens of thousands.
Since yesterday morning, so many of us have felt helpless and wanting to give what help we can. Kelly Lynn has told us that we can give the gift of life by calling 1-800-LIFE and giving blood, making an appointment with the Red Cross to donate blood in the next couple of days. It will be needed. There is also the USNS Comfort, which is lying in wait at Baltimore's harbor. Alex Dimitrick is there now with an update on that ship. Alex?
Well, Sally, you're right. The Comfort, which we'd expected would be leaving for New York a couple of hours ago, it has not left. It is on what the Navy calls a 6-hour tether. That means it's basically on standby. It could leave any time within the 6-hour period, or it may not leave at all. A lot of this, of course, depends upon how many injured survivors they are finding up in New York to determine whether or not this ship is actually going to be needed up there. The injured that have been found are already being treated. So right now it's a wait-and-see mode inside the ship. You've got 150 medical personnel from the Bethesda Naval Hospital, doctors, nurses, technicians. You also have a civilian crew which has spent the night getting the ship fired up, getting it ready for sea. They can leave within an hour once they get the word, but again, they're just waiting for that word one way or another, and when they get it, we'll certainly pass it on to you.
Hi, thank you very much, Alex Dimitrick, reporting live from the USNS Comfort in Baltimore's harbor.
All right, we're slipping back to the Pentagon again, south of the Potomac River, Arlington, Virginia, where Kai Jackson reported to us just a few minutes ago, and we brought him up to date on something we had heard from inside. Kai, have you been able to glean some more information from outside now? Kai. All right, Kai apparently is getting his earpiece back in. And while we wait for Kai to become communicative again, we're going to go back to our Eyewitness Newsroom where Vic Carter is standing by. Vic?
Hi, Don. We've been sampling some of the information that's coming in on people's opinions from across the country and around the world. One of the things that we have here is a CBS News poll that was conducted by Gallup Company. They interviewed 619 adults. Here's how Americans are feeling right now in the wake of this horrible tragedy. Almost 9 out of 10 said they consider the attacks an act of war. 9 in 10 said the attacks were the most tragic event in their lifetime. ABC Washington Post poll also conducted interviews with a number of their listeners and their readers. About 9 in 10 support military action against groups or nations responsible for the attacks, even if it means getting into a war. 9 in 10 said they prayed for the victims of the attacks, and almost everyone, 99%, said they watched or listened to broadcast news reports. And I can attest to that everywhere I went this morning, even stopping to get gas myself. People stopped and asked me about more information about what happened yesterday. 6 in 10 said the attacks were another Pearl Harbor, and almost that many thought they would result in the United States going to war. 2/3 said the United States should retaliate even if innocent people are killed. Majorities of men and women favored that step, though men were more likely to favor it. And lastly, almost 6 in 10 said U.S. intelligence should have known about the attacks in advance and thought the attacks could have been prevented by tighter airport security. We, of course, will continue to sample information like this that is coming through. We'll continue talking to our own viewers here in the Baltimore area to hear what they have to say, their reaction to what has happened yesterday, and, of course, the aftermath that will continue to follow. Back to you in the studio.
All right, thank you very much. I spent a lot more time than the two of you yesterday being a viewer and flipping around and watching everybody's coverage and stuff like that. And it's amazing to me. One of the things we're doing right now is we're dialing up Kai Jackson so we can have communications. And the cell phone has not only changed our business in the world, but it has certainly changed this story since yesterday. We've heard overnight that almost every of the 4 flights, on every of the 4 flights, someone made a cell phone call to somebody to tell them that the hijacking was going on. The initial confusion we had yesterday about the jet that crashed near Pittsburgh, that people had said it was going to crash at Camp David, was because someone on board that flight got a hold of a relative on a cell phone and said, we've been hijacked, we're headed for Camp David. That's how that report came out when the plane crashed. Of course, the proximity between Somerset County, Pennsylvania, just above the Maryland line, and Thurmont, just below it, everybody assumed that they had made their destination, that perhaps the terrorist had hit that target, if that was indeed their target. We had Mark Bingham's mother on this program earlier this hour, who admittedly, if you saw her, must have been in a state of shock from her demeanor. But her son called her and in a very formal way told her that the plane was being hijacked. And then
so this is Mark Bingham.
Yeah.
And then there have been the stories of people calling their loved ones basically to say goodbye. They knew that the woman Barbara Olson, who we talked about this morning, was on one of the flights from Dulles and said, you're not going to believe this, we're being hijacked. Goodbye.
And also people in New York City who fear that their loved ones are trapped underneath the rubble of the World Trade Center have spent the night dialing constantly their cell phones, hoping that if rescuers are nearby and hear a ring, hear a fugue, hear Old Lang Syne being played from beneath the rubble by a cell phone ringing, that maybe someone will be able to dig down and get someone who is still alive. The most amazing use of the cell phone I've heard thus far.
Let's hope it works.
And
We're
so
going to
far,
go back
it
to
hasn't,
BWI Airport now. Yakenda McGahey is awaiting an announcement, I believe, for 1 o'clock, Yakenda, about the future opening of BWI?
Definitely. As a matter of fact, we're setting up right here in just minutes. We're expected to hear from BWI as to what's going to happen with the airport today, if they're going to reopen. You know, you must know that in New York and in Washington, D.C., and they say the D.C. area, that the airports in New York and the D.C. area are not going to reopen today. So that kind of leaves us in limbo as to when BWI Airport will open. The Federal Aviation Administration has given the okay for airports across the country to resume air travel. However, they're leaving it up to individual airports and airlines as to what they're going to do. Delta has suspended their flights until at least 6 o'clock this evening. So we're still wondering what's going to happen with BWI. They say they're going to give us an update at 1 o'clock, and we'll know something, and we'll let you know when we find out. Back to you.
Okay, thanks, Yakenda. Yakenda McGahey reporting live from BWI.
You know, there was a constant stream of traffic behind her, even though we've been telling people for a long time that the airport is not reopening at noon, as we said yesterday. A lot of people must have taken yesterday's deadline or reopening guesses as gospel, and it's still showing up at the airport, because every time we've gone to Yakenda, police are turning away car after car after car. Speaking of airlines,
I just got some more information in my ear. Excuse me, Don. Eyewitness News has just learned that Attorney General John Ashcroft and also the director of the FBI will be speaking to us at 3 o'clock today, so we should get some more information on the investigation into who's responsible for yesterday's tragic attack on America.
Again, as long as we're on the subject of airlines, we were just a second ago, we now have a more complete list of those on all 4 flights. We're going to run that for you right now, let you look at it and see if you recognize anybody from across the country. Of course, we've showed you the locals, the area people who are on it. Just to wrap up the airline thing, of course, you know by now perhaps that 2 of those flights were from Boston to Los Angeles. One was from Newark to San Francisco, and the other, of course, was Dulles to Los Angeles, and of course it never got north of the Virginia line.
A lot of kids without parents today and parents without kids. We need to bring you up to date on an announcement that Eyewitness News just got wind of. The Coast Guard has closed outside boat traffic coming into the Inner Harbor, the Potomac River, and the Woodrow Wilson Bridge.
Yeah, I guess the Woodrow Wilson Bridge goes across the Potomac, so that must be the level at which they are, you know, stopping the traffic.
Right.
And just a A couple of bridges north of that is where Kai Jackson is. We have dialed up Kai now on his cell phone. We can talk back and forth, I believe. Kai, did you manage to get further
Don,
information?
We can talk. Right. Don, I want to give an answer to the question that Sally had a short time ago. And the answer to that question, Sally, is there was an evacuation. The reports that I'm hearing over here is that there was a concern about an unidentified aircraft. And so the Pentagon was indeed evacuated. We couldn't see very much of that from the side where we are. We're looking at the west side of the Pentagon. At this time, we do understand that people have been allowed back into the Pentagon facility. But for a time, people were being evacuated because of a concern of an unidentified flying aircraft, not because of smoke and not because of fire. That's what we know at this point. The rescue efforts, recovery efforts, again, continue very delicately here in Arlington, Virginia. A massive amount of military and law enforcement personnel are just scoured all over the grounds here at the Pentagon facility. There are federal agents posted just about anywhere. I can tell you, if you cross the yellow tape line, which is behind me, you're going to be approached quite swiftly by a federal agent or someone from the Pentagon or someone from the military, putting you back here or possibly removing you from this location, if not arresting you at the very least. But they are scouring the grounds, and when I say scouring the grounds, I should also note that the FBI is in on this process, looking for probably anything that might give them some information about what happened in the subsequent moments before and after the 757 slammed into the west wall of the Pentagon. Again, it's just an unbelievable sight. We heard earlier today from a gentleman from Fairfax County Fire and Rescue that this was very similar to the destruction that happened in Oklahoma City back in 1995. And as I took a closer look with some binoculars a short time ago, the levels of the Pentagon are actually like pancaked on top of each other. But hopefully they're going to be able to make some progress, some headway in removing some of that debris. And as they are able to do that, we'll bring that information to you. Don, Sally, back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Kai. We may be able to add a little bit to your story about the unidentified aircraft.
Kai, we'll see you at 5.
Yeah. About an hour and a half ago, Ukenim Gehi, while she was working the area around BWI, there was tremendous media excitement when they saw a plane take off from the runway at BWI, when everybody knew the
airport's closed.
And so at first, we had plenty of tape of this because we didn't know what was going on. It turns out to be the Department of Defense was flying out of BWI, a search and rescue team, to an undisclosed location, we were told. And it's funny that they would start to evacuate the Pentagon, where the Department of Defense is headquartered, if the unidentified plane is the one we're talking about leaving from BWI for the Department of Defense. But as you know, if you work in an office, that sometimes the person who's working at the desk next to you doesn't know what you're doing, and you don't know what he or she is doing. So it's possible one part of the Pentagon did not know that the other part was sending a plane up from Baltimore.
Well, and everybody, understandably, is so on edge today.
Sure, and would be even more so if air traffic had resumed at noon like it was supposed to. Again, BWI is closed indefinitely at this point.
Stay with Eyewitness News for team coverage of the latest updates surrounding yesterday's terrorist attacks that have stunned the nation.
And thank you for spending this time with us. Don Scott.
Sally Thorner, I'll see you at 5.
Attack on America. Dan Rather, reporting from CBS News World Headquarters in New York, with Ed Bradley and Anthony Mason here with me at the anchor desk. It's 1 in the afternoon in the east, and this is what lower Manhattan looks like. Smoke still bellowing high into the sky 28 hours after 2 crashing hijacked airliners toppled the twin World Trade Towers. New York City Mayor Giuliani says 259 uniformed city officers, that includes firemen and police, remain unaccounted for, and that scores of dump trucks swept the night hauling away rubble. Here's the latest. The FAA had hoped to lift its unprecedented ban on commercial flights at noon, but this has not yet happened. The FAA, in effect, has reversed its previous decision. We simply don't know what they're going to decide about resuming flights. President Bush calls the attacks, quote, acts of war. Here in New York, the confirmed death toll is 41 officially, with 1,700 injured. That toll will go dramatically up. There's a huge problem of clearing away the rubble and finding the dead, and for that matter, people who may still be alive. The mayor says, quote, a few thousand are missing. Searchers do not expect to find more survivors from the Pentagon attack. with the death toll at the Defense Department ranging from a low of 100, well, upward from there. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld thinks it will not reach what some people estimated as the 800 figure. The search for life under the Trade Center rubble is still the big story, the main story, and here tracking that effort is our 60 Minutes colleague, Ed Bradley. Ed?
Dan, there are bits and pieces of information coming in. We've just been told that, and some had heard earlier, that federal officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity said that they were investigating whether one group of hijackers crossed the Canadian border at a checkpoint there and then went to Boston's airport where the two airliners that brought down the World Trade Center were hijacked. The Boston Herald, quoting a source that did not identify, reported that the authorities had seized a car at Logan Airport that contained Arabic language flight training manuals, and the source said 5 Arab men had been identified as suspects, including one of them who was a trained pilot. So that there are leads out there, but there aren't many, at least many that we know of. But the noose is tightening because they do have things that they're following, and it's just a massive investigative effort to track all of these leads down.
And investigators are looking, as you say, to Florida, Canada, and beyond for answers to the single question, who could have done that? Who could have carried this off? And also who financed it? Let's check in with Sandra Hughes at Los Angeles International Airport. Sandra?
Well, Dan, you and Ed were speaking before about the security issues, and there's been a lot of talk about beefing up security at airports across the country and how things are never going to be the same after yesterday. Well, CBS News has learned through our local affiliate here in Los Angeles that did an investigation back in 1999, an undercover investigation, that security personnel at the metal detectors have actually less training than the Starbucks coffee workers at the airport. If you can believe that, 1.5 days of training is all that those security personnel go through. And as Ed mentioned, even the General Accounting Office has found in a report that security personnel are poorly trained and that many don't even make as much money as fast food workers. Now, what we are finding out is that some airports are already implementing some changes. At Seattle-Tacoma's airport, the airport has announced that in restaurants, metal silverware is out. They will only now be using plastic silverware, and no knives of any kind will be allowed through a metal detector through any sort of security gate. Dan?
Sandra Hughes at Los Angeles International Airport. Now back to Washington and our chief Washington correspondent, John Roberts. John?
Well, Dan, the bipartisan leadership from Capitol Hill just emerged from what was almost a 90-minute meeting with President Bush in the cabinet room where they were discussing the crisis and the appropriate American response to it. Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, and Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle came out and said, Dan, and this is very important, a very important signal that they are trying to send this morning, both leaders saying very firmly that Congress would stand shoulder to shoulder, Republican and Democrat, together with the president to support whatever measures the president decides. Speaker Hastert saying, anytime someone takes this country for granted, this Congress will stand united shoulder to shoulder. We will work together. We are in complete agreement that we will support the president. Senator Daschle saying that we literally and figuratively stand shoulder to shoulder. We want to care for the families and punish those responsible. Later on today, Congress will take up a very strongly worded resolution condemning this act and expressing the united commitment of Congress to stand behind the president to address this situation. Senator Daschle going on to say we stand not as Republicans or Democrats, but as Americans. Now, earlier today, Dan, following his meeting with his National Security Council, including Secretary of State Powell, the Vice President, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice's National Security Advisor, and others, the president issued some of his strongest language yet in response to the terrorist attacks yesterday, saying the deliberate and deadly attacks that were carried out yesterday against our country were more than acts of terror. They were acts of war. Now, the declaration that these were acts of war certainly does not trigger an official declaration of war by this country. There is some question as to whether who you would issue that declaration against, even if you were. But certainly, Dan, it ramps up the language, and in ramping up the language, it ramps up the commensurate response as well. We spoke yesterday to some degree of how justice did not necessarily mean bringing whoever was responsible to the United States to set them before the bar of justice. It would probably mean a decisive and punitive military attack, Dan. And this charged language this morning about these being acts of war certainly leads in that direction. Dan?
Well, John, when you talk about decisive military action, let's review what kind of, quote, decisive military action is possible, even when and if they determine somebody to attack.
Well, Dan, you'll remember following the embassy bombings in Eastern Africa, there was some criticism of the Clinton administration that they fired a few cruise missiles at some sandhills in Afghanistan, and what damage did they really do? There, of course, was the damage to some facilities in and around Khartoum in Sudan. But what did that really accomplish? Osama bin Laden, if they were trying to get him, certainly escaped from that. Let's not forget, though, who was backing up the president's language about decisive and punishing retaliation here. We're talking about Colin Powell, whose doctrine was overwhelming force during the Persian Gulf War. We're talking about Donald Rumsfeld, who is a seasoned veteran of the Pentagon, and we're talking about Dick Cheney, who, as Secretary of Defense under George Bush the Elder, prosecuted the Persian Gulf War. These are people who have experience in using force, Dan, and the experience that they have in using force is to use as much as possible to get the job done. Now, not saying that in this case they will be able to do that, but at least that's the philosophy from whence they come.
John Roberts at the White House. Ed Bradley has a developing story, granted a side story for the moment, a developing story in Boston, Ed.
Well, Dan, as you know, two of the planes were hijacked in Boston. We've just been told that a SWAT team composed of FBI officers as well as Boston police officers have stormed into the Westin Hotel in Boston's Back Bay. They're heavily armed. They went in carrying shields. We don't know if this is related to the hijacking in Boston, but they're moving in and apparently searching through the hotel. There, as we said, dozens of police officers and FBI agents who are now inside the hotel. What they're doing, we can't say for sure, but it certainly would seem to be related to the continuing search for people who were involved in this hijacking.
Well, this photograph is from outside the Westin Copley Hotel, and that's where the FBI bomb squad went in just a short while ago. Details of what that is about, we could only speculate, and that we are not going to do. But this is the live picture in Boston of where this FBI SWAT team in full gear, including bullet-resistant vests and automatic weapons, has just gone into this hotel. As I say, no one knows what that's about, but it'll be interesting to see as time goes along.
Well, there was one graphic before that said they had 700 leads. So they have to follow up a lot of these leads. This may just be a case of them trying to follow it up.
Very well could be, and we mentioned the FBI, but also, as you see, the Boston police helping the FBI there, and it was, if anything, the police who came in numbers. This is not unusual. The FBI says, listen, we want to go in here, and we don't know what kind of situation we're getting into, and they call for help from the local police force and get it. So we'll try to keep you posted as time goes along about what that was about in Boston. We simply don't know at the moment, although, as Ed Bradley points out, the probability is that among the 700 leads, the FBI prioritizes and, for whatever reason, decided to go into that hotel in Boston and follow up on a lead. Let's check in with retired U.S. Army Colonel Mitch Mitchell, our old friend from the Persian Gulf War, who was near the Pentagon when the plane went down yesterday. Colonel, always good to see you. What was it like?
Nice to see you, Dan. It was a tragic event, Dan. We saw the last 7 seconds of Flight 77. We were driving south on Route 395, which butts up against the Pentagon. We were exactly adjacent to the Pentagon when I looked out in front of me and saw the American Airlines plane coming right across the highway directly in front of us at a distance of about 100 feet and an altitude of no higher than 20 feet. We thought it was going to hit us. All I had time to say was, it's going to hit the Pentagon. We turned and looked and watched it slam into the building. It was a terrible thing to see, Dan. I wish I'd never seen it.
Well, Colonel, one question has been asked me, and I don't have the answer, and perhaps you do. These hijacked aircraft were in the air for quite a while. They made unusual turns, to say the least. Why doesn't the Pentagon have the kind of protection that they could get fighter or interceptor aircraft up, and if somebody's going to plow an aircraft into the Pentagon, that we have at least some line of defense?
This is one of the most difficult attacks to defend against, Dan. Even if we scramble the fighters, it takes time for them to get in the air and get to the location where the attack is going to occur, and they certainly didn't give us much time after they left Dulles Airport. The point is, though, that the air traffic controllers have to determine that there really is an emergency, and it takes some time for them to discern exactly what the situation is, especially when they're dealing with aircraft that are handled by apparently professional pilots who know how to turn off transponders. They're not sure what they have in the air exactly, and so until they can understand what the situation is, they're not going to scramble the military. Only then can the military be effective. And I might add that if they had been called in to shoot down this plane, they would have had to shoot it down at ground level and caused a number of civilian casualties on the way into the Pentagon. Probably the lesser of the two evils, but it was a lose-lose situation.
Colonel, thank you very much, and we'll be talking to you as the day and the evening goes along. Dateline Boston, heavily armed police and FBI agents swarmed into a downtown Boston hotel, and CBS News 48 Hours producer Josh Yeager is on the scene. Josh, tell us what happened at the Boston Copeland.
Dan, I'm standing in front of the Boston Copley Hotel, one of the most chic hotels in Boston. Security is heavy and tensions are high here. There are at least 30 armed Boston police officers here, an EMS, Emergency Medical Services truck. I saw several ATF agents entering the building. It's been reported here that police are interested in this building because there's rumors of a suspect on the 16th floor. While I have not seen any FBI personally, it has been reported that FBI are inside the building. Police within the last 5 minutes have moved the crowd of roughly 2,000 citizens and press back from the front door of the hotel. And I say again, tensions are high. We are waiting to find out what's going to happen, and we are not alone. Dan?
Josh Yeager on the scene in Boston. By the way, law enforcement sources say no arrests were made. Ed Bradley?
Yeah, no arrests were made.
No arrests have been made so far, no. It does seem like something's about to happen, but nothing's happened by way of an arrest so far.
Thanks, Josh. Ed?
I think what they found was an empty room, that they have evidence that indicates that that room might have been used by one of the hijackers, and they were going in to A, see if there was anyone else there, and B, search that room.
Let's go back now to Washington and Colonel Mitch Mitchell. Colonel, what about the options for retaliation? By the way, before you answer that question, let me point out to our viewers, we swing with the news here, and what looked like a story developing in Boston turns out, for at least the moment, to be a lot of picture and not much story. Now, Colonel, thanks for bearing with us. Let's talk about the retaliation options. There's a lot of tough talk coming out of Washington. But as we know, talk is cheap. When you get down to the reality, what retaliation options are there?
Dan, the smart thing to do is to get the proper intelligence about what actually happened and why it happened and who was responsible for it. Once you pinpoint the responsible party, and of course everyone is saying it's Osama bin Laden, and I believe that too, once you've determined that, then you go for the target, and you have to have a specific plan, just as if you were engaging in an invasion. It's a military operation. It has to be carefully planned out and very, very carefully executed. And all those things take time. You want to make sure that you don't cast your net out there and come up empty. You've got to catch the guy the first time you go after him. So I think we're going to do some detailed planning, make sure that we have the right target, and then we will send in overwhelming and powerful force to attack that target and hopefully rid ourselves of this person once and for all.
Colonel Mitchell, it's a tough fact to face, but face it we must, that Afghanistan is the graveyard for Western military operations, and for that matter, the Soviets learned the hard way. Anybody who goes into Afghanistan meets an unusually determined opposition. It's just a way of saying, put this in context for us. Suddenly we're talking about, overwhelming military force in Afghanistan, but is that really an option?
It can happen, Dan, but what we don't want to do is go the route the Soviet Union went when they went in and stayed in there and got sucked in, as we did in Vietnam, and stay and stay and stay. What we need is a clear-cut plan that says exactly what we're going to execute and how we're going to get out of there. And I would expect something like this would be over very quickly. It wouldn't be a matter of months or years. It would be a matter of days before we executed what we had to execute. And by the way, President Bush was very clear in his statement when he said that he's going to be looking at those who harbor such people as Osama bin Laden. So I think we would have a big mission in a country like that.
Colonel, thank you again. We may want to come back to you right now. Ed Bradley has an update on this security situation in Boston. Ed?
Well, Dan, when Boston's Logan Airport does reopen, the aviation director there said that the FAA was going to require all U.S. airports to comply with some emergency safety measures. As Sandra Hughes mentioned, that would include banning the sale or the use of knives, even plastic knives at the airport. They want to evacuate and sweep all of the terminals in this country with K-9 teams, and they want all U.S. airports to comply with some emergency safety measures. They're going to do increased security personnel checks. They're going to increase ID checks, and they are definitely going to discontinue curbside check-in.
Ed Bradley, if Colonel Mitchell is still with us in Washington, Colonel, I hope that you're still there. What about the arguments, and we've heard some on the air the last few days, that, look, American intelligence and our whole decision-making apparatus in Washington is so focused on Osama bin Laden and not even seriously considering the possibility that some state-supported terrorist operation may be, if anything, working in conjunction with Osama bin Laden, and of course the name Saddam Hussein comes to the tip of the tongue pretty quickly.
Yes, Dan. There has to be some state sponsorship in here. How would those pilots who flew those airplanes be trained? They certainly were not going to get trained in Afghanistan. So there has to be some connection. And that's what makes the job for our intelligence people so difficult. Not only do we have to pinpoint the mastermind behind such an attack, but we have to see all his partners as well and make sure that we bring them to justice at the same time. State-sponsored terrorism is indeed a possibility here. And when we say we conduct a war on terrorism, that isn't saying anything at all. We have to be much more specific and say exactly who we're conducting this war against and who that we are going to use to defeat them. Notice also we have allies now who are starting to come to our assistance and say, we will join you in this hunt. So the European Union is beginning to make noise about that, and I think that's a good thing, because the terrorists are going to start feeling the pinch of more than just the United States statement that they're going to retaliate.
Let us hope. Thanks very much, Mitchell. Let's go to John Franklin in Lower Manhattan. John?
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. Again, we are at North Moore and the West Side Highway. I'm guessing about 5 or 6 blocks north of where the World Trade Center's towers once stood. You can still make out the smoke. Fires probably still burning, very intense heat, and also the weather of today, which is hot out, is not helping things either. We know that there have been lots of heavy construction vehicles that have made their way down to the site. There are many more that are still lined up here along West Side Highway. Big, heavy dump trucks that will help take out much of the debris as they make their way through it piece by piece, because obviously they're still looking for some survivors in the attack. We know that we have seen pictures of some of these dump trucks and these bulldozers actually holding up some structures so that the workers can get in there and remove some of this debris. And we have also seen a good number of EMT personnel make their way down. So as the clock continues to tick, fresh personnel making their way into the area, trying to get down, relieving those that have been working through the night and under these intense conditions. So it's both an objective to remove the debris and to still try and find those who may have survived through the night and are under some of that rubble. Dan?
John Franco. Now overseas, CBS News correspondent Mark Phillips in our CBS News Bureau in London. Mark, bring us up to date on what's happening with NATO. Another important meeting is either in progress or about to be.
We expect to hear from NATO within the next hour that they are doing something they have never done before, which is to invoke Article 5 of the North Atlantic Charter. That's the charter which declares that an attack on one country in NATO is an attack on all and commits each member to take such action as is necessary. I'm quoting here the use of armed forces, for example, to restore and maintain security in the North Atlantic area. While all of the options, retaliation options, are being discussed, finding the culprits, of course, and then finding where they are and finding targets. What's happening here in Europe is that the groundwork is being laid, if you will, the foundations of support for any American action and perhaps even international action is being laid so that there isn't then an issue of discussing who will participate, what bases can be used, and that sort of thing. A NATO meeting is scheduled to be happening within the next 10 minutes, and we expect to hear within the next 40 minutes or so that this charter, never before invoked, has been invoked. There's been a lot of discussion here. Prime Minister Blair, of course, has recalled Parliament, which had been in recess, saying this was an attack on the very notion of a democracy and that democratic voices ought to be heard. Blair as well, along with many other world leaders, spoke to President Bush today as the areas of discussion included, no doubt, cooperation in any future action that might be taken. Blair was very specific in not commenting on what individual aspects might be undertaken, which bases might be used, and that kind of thing. He said these were just not appropriate areas of discussion. And one final area, one final interesting point is that there was another statement today from the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, basically saying that any attack would only sow the seeds of further anger and further hatred in the region. Dan?
Mark Phillips in London for developments, and there are some breaking at the moment. Jim Stewart in Washington. Jim.
Dan, federal authorities have conducted and completed a raid on a hotel in downtown Boston that they believe may apparently have been used by one of the hijackers, but they're not certain yet. They are inside one of the rooms in the hotel conducting a search there. There have been reports that people have been arrested in connection with this case as a result of that raid. I would tell you that is not true. There have been no arrests made in connection with the terrorist attacks thus far. People have been taken into custody, we are told, but these are people who apparently had problems with the INS, the Immigration Naturalization Service, that were discovered as a process of these raids. I can also say that I believe this is a sequence of events that we're going to see unfold throughout the day in various parts of the country. Some of this comes as a result of intelligence tips and intelligence communications intercepts, and some of it is coming as a result of a study of the flight manifest, people who were on that flight that they think deserve more attention, relatives of people on that flight who they think deserve more attention. I can also say that that federal authorities believe now, having gone through all of the telephone conversations that were going back and forth yesterday, and I have to tell you, Dan, it becomes more incredible to me by the hour, the number of phone calls that were made from these doomed aircraft while they were in the sky, apparently some with the blessings and insistence even of the hijackers. This one, however, apparently did not have their blessing. A person phoned from Flight 93, this is the United aircraft, recall, that left Newark and was en route to San Francisco and crashed in Pennsylvania. This passenger called and said that a fight had broken out apparently between other passengers and the hijackers, and that the passengers were attempting to control the aircraft. The conversation ended then. The presumption is that this fight led to a loss of control. The airplane was, we are told, was at approximately 500 feet level flight when it nosed into the ground. In other developments today, the FBI is also conducting search warrants, as we reported earlier, at 2 commercial flight schools in Florida. It is thought that these 2 schools were the sites where some of these hijackers learned their trade. These men are believed to have had a long-standing relationship to Ramzi Youssef, a name well known to terrorist experts. He was involved, as you might recall, in the first failed attempt to bomb the World Trade Center in 1993. That's all we have from here at the moment. Dan?
Jim Stewart, we've had pieces of the story, and now we get additional pieces. On that United flight that left Newark and then wound up crashing in southwestern Pennsylvania, a hellacious scene ensued in that airline, and we now see that some of the passengers, some of the men passengers, realized that what was going on and made an attempt to fight. This becomes clearer if we pick up additional information from cell phone calls made from the aircraft. The picture painted is one of heroics, the full extent of which we may never know. But the picture does begin to get filled out, that this aircraft had turned around, was being headed back toward Washington, or in the area of Camp David, the presidential retreat, And when some of the male passengers in the plane realized some of what was happening, they attacked the hijackers, and the plane wound up crashing about 80 miles from Pittsburgh. Anthony Mason, let me check with if there are some developments on the financial page in this last hour. Bring us up to date on that.
We've got a joint statement, Dan, from the finance ministers and the central bankers of the group of 7 nations. These are the 7 wealthiest nations. Basically what they're saying, I'm going to quote them, "We are committed to ensuring that this tragedy will not be compounded by disruption to the global economy." Basically, they're saying we're going to make sure that any bankers out there who need money can get it. We're going to make sure this economy stays up and running, that the global economy is not disrupted. This is a show of unification, a show of support, an attempt to prevent, damage to global confidence at this point.
And what's happening on the foreign markets? What's happening in Tokyo, Hong Kong, London?
I don't have the latest numbers, but the encouraging news this morning from Europe was that that after initially going down, the FTSE in London, the DAX in Frankfurt, both actually turned around and went up for the day. I'm not sure where they stand at the moment. But the initial damage was yesterday. Today, people seem to kind of pull back. Trading is light. Really, the entire financial world now, I think, is just kind of standing back to watch things settle. You have enormous disruption in New York, but in fact, the financial world is functioning. I talked to some bankers today who said the Fed stayed open very late last night, so all these banks could resolve all of their transactions, and in fact did. A banker told me, he said, we actually closed our books last night. When you consider everything that happened, that's pretty amazing.
Ed Bradley, change the subject very quickly, but we've been talking about intelligence, how to improve it, why it didn't alert us to these tragic events. But one thing, American intelligence over the last 15 to 25 years has moved increasingly into high tech and away from what we call on-the-ground human resources.
I think that has been the big criticism from a lot of intelligence experts, is that we are very reliant on sophisticated listening gear. We've seen it all in the movies, and some of it does exist, where key words will turn on a computer to record a conversation.
For example, if you're talking on the phone, you mentioned Osama bin Laden, it gets
clicks in. And that these are picked up by satellites, that they can monitor any telephone call, landline, cell phones, very sophisticated listening devices. But where the United States is weak is in the area of human intelligence. And we've seen it repeatedly in Iraq, for example, in the inability to put someone on the ground in Iraq who can give you information from Saddam Hussein's inner circle. In Afghanistan, to put someone on the ground in the inner circle with Osama bin Laden, to give you human intelligence, or even not just in the inner circle, but someone who can stand off at a distance and say, this is where they are today. I mean, this is a man who supposedly moves 3 or 4 times a week. How do they keep track of him? And we are very good on these sophisticated intelligence listening devices, and not as good when it comes to human intelligence and putting people on the ground to eyeball what is going on.
And if you think it's tough to do that in Iraq, Afghanistan would be much, much more difficult. Our CBS News coverage of the attack on America will continue after a few seconds. We break away to give some of our stations an opportunity to go to local coverage if they choose to do so, but on many of these stations, we'll be right back after a break of only 5 to 7 seconds with more of our CBS coverage of the attack on America. Hello again, Dan Rather at CBS News World Headquarters in New York with Anthony Mason and Ed Bradley. It's 1:30 now in the East. Here are the headlines of the hour on the attack on America, which President Bush today declared an act of war. That was his word. SWAT teams raided Boston's Westin Hotel this afternoon, an accident that may or may not be related to the terror attacks, although Jim Stewart just reported the FBI had some leads on information that might be in a hotel room, and that's what this raid in Boston was about. 2 of the aircraft hijacked yesterday took off from Boston's Logan Airport. The official death toll in the attacks that brought down New York's World Trade Center towers stands at 41, but thousands are still missing. That includes 259 firefighters and police officers. Outside Washington, D.C., parts of the Pentagon are still burning. 73 survivors were pulled from the building, and defense officials now say they do not expect to find any more survivors. The number of Pentagon dead is now expected to be well below the highest estimate that some news organizations were kicking around yesterday and last night of 800. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld thinks the death toll at the Pentagon will be well below 800, but may very well be in the low hundreds. Commercial air traffic is still shut down coast to coast, with the FAA undecided when to lift its ban. Yes, it was supposed to go off at noon today Eastern Time, but the FAA in the end did not lift the ban. No one knows when any kind of air travel will be resumed, but the FAA is in the process of deciding. And no one should expect, we're told, that even when the ban on air travel is lifted, no one should expect that all airlines at all airports will immediately get back to anything approaching normal. Let's check back in with Jim Stewart in Washington on the continuing investigation into who was responsible for these acts of terror. Jim?
Dan, the FBI has conducted a raid on the Westin Hotel in downtown Boston. This is a special weapons and tactics team that was seen entering the hotel. Our information is that the FBI believed that one of the hijackers possibly stayed in a room at the hotel. Some people have been taken into custody, but no one, I repeat, no one to our knowledge has been arrested in connection with the events that occurred yesterday. So the people that have been taken into custody are apparently wanted for questions regarding their status with the INS. Additional search warrants are being conducted this afternoon in Florida, specifically around 2 commercial aviation schools there, where it is thought that possibly some of the men involved in hijacking those aircraft yesterday received their sophisticated training on how to fly commercial aircraft. Federal agents also are releasing some detail of what occurred with the mystery flight, if you will, yesterday of United Flight 93. That's the one that was headed from Newark to San Francisco, apparently hijacked and crashed somewhere in Pennsylvania as it had turned to head back toward the Washington, D.C. area. They say that plane was a part of this process of hijackings and terrorist events, and that a passenger aboard that plane made a phone call and described that other passengers had begun fighting with the men who had hijacked this aircraft. Apparently, in the process of that fight, the aircraft did go down. Federal agents say they assumed that its target was somewhere either in the Camp David or Washington, D.C. area. It is now, of course, impossible to tell. Dan?
Jim, Dateline Boston, the Associated Press quotes one reporter on the scene as saying that one person was taken out of the hotel in the van, one person was arrested, and that one person was wounded in that combined FBI police raid on the hotel. Do you have any indication whether that report is true or not?
Dan, I have no knowledge of anyone being wounded. The only precise information I have is that people who have been taken into custody, who are literally under arrest, if you will, are being held on charges that are not related directly to the events yesterday, who may have been in violation of some INS. That is not to say that the raid that was conducted at this location won't turn up evidence of some of the people who did participate having stayed at the hotel. But right now, I'm told there have been no arrest of people who were accomplices in the attacks yesterday, and I will quote you one senior official who told me, frankly, he's not holding his breath that we will see any such arrest today. And one postscript, Dan, and that is, as I'm sure you'll recall, during the Oklahoma City bombing, we went through a period of days after the bombing in which there were a series of arrests on an almost hourly basis of people who appeared to resemble John Doe 2 and other tips that proved to be wrong. I anticipate we're going to see a whole spat of those before this day is out. Dan?
Jim Stewart in Washington. Let's electronically skip to Boston and 48 Hours producer and CBS News reporter Josh Yeager. Josh?
Dan, still at the Westin Copley, where for the last 5 minutes the scene has been pandemonium. This crowd, now at more than 10,000 in my estimation, has been pushed back against its will by police. About 5 minutes ago, a squad of 15 to 20 police, heavily armed in riot gear, came out of the front of the hotel, holding up riot shields. We were in the process of being pushed back, and I was actually knocked over. Couldn't see it myself, but people in a different vantage point reported seeing one person brought out of the hotel, as Jim Stewart reported, put into a silver, secure van. The police then cleared us back even further and have parked 50-some-odd police motorcycles, 2 ambulances in front of the hotel, and cordoned off the whole area with yellow tape. Someone else I spoke to in the crowd, I should mention, said that he saw 3 people being taken out and put in the van. I can't confirm that either way for you. Dan?
Josh Yeager in Boston. Now we go back to Washington. CBS News correspondent Bob Orr, who's come up with some additional information about what happened on the 4 hijacked flights yesterday. Bob?
Dan, I'm most intrigued by what correspondent Jim Stewart just told us about United Airlines Flight 93. And it may go a long way to understanding why that particular plane did not make its target, whatever that target was. We showed you the radar track yesterday on that plane, and it took off from Newark in a normal course across the northern tier of states bound for San Francisco. But as it got out around the Cleveland, Ohio area, it started to turn around in virtually a U-turn and head back towards the Pittsburgh vicinity. Air traffic controllers tried several times, we're told, to radio that cockpit crew to find out what was going on, and there was no response. We now know from these cell phone calls that what was going on is there was at least 3 hijackers on the plane, and apparently a scuffle broke out. Passengers took what might turn out to be very heroic action and at least distracted the hijackers and maybe thwarted their attempt. In any case, we know from the radar tapes what happened. This plane was on a relatively normal, and I use that word advisedly, easterly course when it got over the Somerset County, Pennsylvania area, and then it suddenly rolled over sharply and nosed down in a very high impact. This crater, I'm told, is 20 to 30 feet deep, and a good bit of the plane has been buried by the crash impact. This is a Boeing 757, relatively easy to fly. A hijacker with rudimentary skills, or certainly one with good skills, would have no problem whatsoever controlling this airplane. I myself, coincidentally, just last week, flew the Boeing 757 in a simulator, and I can tell you that it's, and I'm not a pilot, it's relatively easy to control. However, if some kind of ruckus breaks out in the cockpit, if there's pushing and shoving, somebody leaning against the control column, that would make the plane completely uncontrollable. One more thing. The caller, one of the callers said that all of the passengers were ushered by the hijackers to the back of the plane. Now, there weren't that many people on the plane, but if you get a sudden shift in weight on an airliner like that, what happens is the nose can either pitch up or down. In this case, it would pitch up. If you're not right on the controls when that happens, the thing that's most likely to happen is the plane continues to climb until it stalls. It then would peel over and go down nose down. If, in fact, the passengers intervened and somehow thwarted the hijacking attempt, and the cockpit tape and the flight data recorder, when they're recovered, might make this case, then they should be observed in this case, Dan, as heroes.
Bob Orr. Ed Bradley, do we have any idea how many hijackers per plane? I mean, were they 3? Were they 6? Do we know?
The government believes now that there were 3 to 5 hijackers on each of those planes, and that more than one on each plane was a trained pilot. And also, I might add that you may have heard yesterday that the Attorney General giving a website for tips. Some 700 tips have already been received at that website that the Attorney General gave the address for yesterday. And the FBI has issued a search warrant on at least one major internet service in order to get information about an email address that may be connected to the terrorist attacks. One of the companies that received the warrant was Earthlink. They have said, along with AOL, which is the nation's largest internet provider, that it will comply with requests, and it will comply with requests in a hurry.
Ed Bradley. Let's go out to Seattle, Washington, and John Magnuson of the firm that helped work on the World Trade Center. Mr. Magnuson, thank you for being with us. We saw 2 buildings collapse. It was an incredible scene. What other word can you use yesterday? We not only thought that this would never happen, we thought it couldn't happen. Why did it happen?
Well, both of the towers actually survived the initial impact from the airplanes, and they stood for about an hour. It was only when they finally were consumed by the fire from the jet fuel that they did collapse. We're actually just very thankful that the buildings didn't collapse immediately like most buildings would have, because that allowed many people to escape to safety.
Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. It wasn't the impact of the aircrafts on the structure of the building that caused them to collapse. It was the subsequent events, and mostly the aviation fuel that exploded?
That's right. The structure was able to survive for at least another hour after the actual impact. And in an office building like the World Trade Center towers or any other office building, there's two systems that are used to deal with the hazard from fire. The first system are the sprinkler systems in the building, and the other system is the fireproofing insulation on the structural steel. When structural steel gets up to about 1,500 to 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, it loses its strength. It loses its ability to carry load. In a normal building, the sprinklers would fight the fire, and then the insulation would protect the steel from reaching that 1,500 degree temperature. With this jet fuel fire, the sprinklers are designed to deliver water. Jet fuel fires, you need to have fire suppressing foam to deal with that kind of a fire. So even if the sprinklers were intact, it would have been the wrong kind of extinguisher to put on the jet fuel fire.
Fascinating. When I was much younger, this is in the 1940s, I think, a plane rammed the Empire State Building. I don't know whether you recall that or not.
Yes.
You being much younger, but you must know about it. But the Empire State Building seemed to absorb that airplane crash, fuel and all. Help us understand the difference.
Right. We're talking about a significant difference in the quantity of the fuel that was on board. These were large, fully loaded jets. Back then, that was a much, much smaller jet. And both the buildings did survive the impact of the plane. And it was only this jet fuel fire that brought about the demise of the building.
Mr. Magnuson, this raises the question, your opinion, the people who flew these aircraft into the building, from what you've said, they must have had a great deal of knowledge of what it would take to bring down these buildings.
Well, you know, it would be difficult to speculate whether they knew precisely what they were doing or whether they just simply wanted to get as low on the building as they could without ramming into some of the other buildings in lower Manhattan there first. As it turned out, they hit at a very difficult spot on the building.
And they also selected aircraft that were loaded with aviation fuel. This gets more interesting as we discuss it. That all of these planes were bound for the West Coast and took off from the East Coast loaded with fuel. So here we have a situation we're asked to believe, and it's not that I just believe, but we're asked to believe that a kind of ragtag terrorist organization got somebody, several somebodies, at least 4 somebodies, knew how to fly sophisticated aircraft, at least for a short distance, selected those planes that would be absolutely loaded with aviation fuel, and crashed them into buildings, the Twin Towers, the World Trade Centers, that could not be destroyed by the impact of the aircraft, but could be destroyed and were destroyed by the fact that this aviation fuel got loose and just, in effect, melted the steel.
Right. I'm not sure if their intent was, they may have thought that the building would have collapsed instantly like Oklahoma City courthouse did. But I'd hate to speculate about how much they knew or what they were thinking. The whole act is just unthinkable to me.
Well, those questions stay out there. Mr. Magnuson, the World Trade Center Twin Towers were built when?
Well, the design work was in the mid-1960s, and construction started in the late 60s and finished up in the early 70s. So it was about 35 years ago that they were designed.
And if one were to design such buildings today, I'm not suggesting they'd be rebuilt on this site or anything, but those are questions yet to be answered. But would it be pretty much designed the same way, a tower such as this?
Yes, actually the design criteria would be very, very similar today for this kind of a building. If this building had been in an earthquake zone like California, there'd be significant differences in the design. But since the design of the World Trade Center Tower was really controlled by the wind load design and handling the hazards due to windstorms, its design today would be very, very similar to what was done 35 years ago.
Mr. Magnuson, when you saw those Twin Towers yesterday collapse, whether you saw it live as it happened or on videotape, as a structural engineer, tell me what you thought.
Well, I guess I ran through the whole range of emotions. The first thing was I couldn't believe what I saw, and then it was more shock. Then there was a sense of relief that they had survived the impact, and I saw the building standing with large holes in each side, and they were still standing. And then it went to concern about the nature of that fire. There was a fire in a high-rise building in Los Angeles, I think it was about 15 years ago, or maybe 10 years ago, that they almost lost that building with a regular fire, with just conventional flames and fuel, no jet fuel. And so then I got to be quite concerned about what that might be doing in the building. And then it went all the way to the emotion of anger. You know, why would anyone do something like this?
And what were for some minutes towering infernos quickly became collapsing infernos.
Right.
John Maxson, thank you very much for being with us in Seattle. We go down to Scott Pelley, who's at ground zero in Lower Manhattan. Scott?
Dan, I'm standing essentially between the two twin towers, or what is left of them. I'm in the area where a huge amount of debris has collapsed into the street. I see a lot of iron workers here, volunteers all, who've come from all over Manhattan and the New York area. They're standing on top of these girders, connecting them to cranes. Very large cranes are pulling them up. It looks like a very well-organized effort here. I'm in the area where a number of physicians and nurses and paramedics are standing by to treat anyone who comes out. But they've been telling me over the last few minutes that they haven't seen much of anything in the way of a sign of life in the last several hours. One nurse I was talking to who came down here as a volunteer located 2 bodies in this morning. One person, the other person had been quite severely burned. They were both deceased. Those bodies were, and the identification on them was taken in order to notify next of kin. The striking thing about this scene, Dan, I'm looking at hundreds and hundreds of people climbing all over this hideous mountain of debris, trying to tear it down, trying to get to the basement levels. The remarkable thing here is the lack of bodies, the fact that you don't see victims lying about. It is thought that they are buried in the center of the buildings under 110 stories of debris. Some of the basement areas, Dan, I'm told, are in remarkably good shape, did not collapse in some of the buildings. They have been searched and cleared, and no one was found alive in that area. But down here at the moment, hundreds and hundreds of people, iron workers, doctors, nurses, all standing by, tearing this building apart, looking for any sign of life. Dan?
Scott Pelley. And as we look at these remarkable pictures of men and women meticulously going through the debris and realizing that, as President Bush has said and Mayor Giuliani has said, that there are many, many people, how many we still do not know, buried in that debris. At the very least, it calls for a moment of silence to absorb this scene. The sights and sounds of Lower Manhattan. And they will go on through the day and again through the night. We go now back to Los Angeles International Airport and Sandra Hughes. Sandra?
Dan, more West Coast airport news. CBS News has learned that officials at Seattle-Tacoma Airport have been told by the FAA that they will be able to reopen the airport by 3 p.m. Pacific. That's 3 p.m. Pacific this afternoon. Now, that is only if the individual airlines have certification from the FAA that they comply with all safety and security measures. One sign at the Seattle-Tacoma Airport, and this might be a temporary measure, warns passengers no carry-on luggage. This even includes women's purses. All they will allow on board is a wallet. Dan?
Sandra Hughes, well, this is yet another development and yet another turn by the FAA, which is trying to get at least some airlines flying. Let's go to Bob Orr in Washington, who covers aviation for us. Bob, what's happening now? The FAA had said at first they might allow some flights at noon, then they said no, but now information comes that at least in the far west they're going to allow some flights.
And Dan, I think it remains to be seen whether operations at SeaTac really do get off and running at 3 o'clock this afternoon. frankly, the FAA and the Department of Transportation have been in high meetings throughout the night and the morning with the Department of Defense and with the White House, the national security folks, and they're trying to come up with a coordinated response that makes some sense, that balances the issue of the need to get the system back online from an economic sense, from a symbolism sense, against the very real risk that security could still be problematic. What Sandra Hughes said there is very important. One of the very first ways we expect the FAA to attack this security problem is to have this almost draconian crackdown on carry-on bags. Think about what happened yesterday. These hijackers went through, presumably, security checkpoints that are equipped with X-ray machines and metal detectors, principally designed to identify guns. Well, they didn't have guns. They had, we're told now, knife-like instruments, in one sense, box cutters with retractable knives. There is no equipment in place at any airport in America today that could take something that looks basically like this pen and identify it if it was in a travel case as a weapon. It's a significant vulnerable point in the aviation security system, and until the folks at the FAA and DOT really come to some kind of resolution as to how to figure out how to fix that, I don't think the planes are going to fly again, Dan. And certainly, even if they do start on a very limited basis in some spotty markets, the system is going to be badly impacted, if not gridlocked, for days, I think.
Bob Orr, live in our Washington Bureau. Let's now go to our chief Washington correspondent, Bob Schieffer. He's with United States Senator Richard Shelby of Alabama, who, Bob, it's my understanding, has just been briefed.
Yes, he has, and Senator Shelby is, Dan, was the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee when the Republicans controlled the Senate. He's now the ranking Republican on the Intelligence Committee and has always been one of the most informed senators on matters such as this. Senator, just bring us up to date. What is the latest? Where do we think this investigation is pointing to right now?
The investigation is ongoing in a big, big way. It's the #1 priority of the FBI and the Justice Department, and it should be in America. I'm sure there will be breaking news, but I'm not here to announce that because of the ongoing investigation. But I believe we will get to the bottom of this. But the question, Bob, is going to be, what are we going to do about it? It can't be a political response. It can't be a tepid response. It's going to be all-out war. The President talked about war. This is real war, and this is not going to go away if we don't really become aggressive to eradicate these cells, wherever they are, wherever they're being trained, wherever they're operating from, in a massive, destructive way. They're going to be coming back. If you don't carry the war to them, we're going to be waiting around, waiting for the next incident here in America. And the American people don't want that.
Well, I don't think there's any question that this Congress, at this particular point in time, would support this president in a war against whoever it is.
Whoever it is.
But who is it?
Well, we're not sure at this moment exactly who it is, but we're getting close, and we're going to know who it is. And when we know who it is, we're going after them. And it can't be a one-shot deal. It's got to be continued until they're gone.
Senator, at this point, though, you can't say, and the intelligence community is not certain at this point, is that correct? Who is behind this? I mean, there are many parallels to Osama bin Laden, but you can't say for sure.
Well, I'm not going to say right now. That would be ultimately up to the CIA director and perhaps the President of the United States to say, but I can tell you there are a lot of parallels. There are just too many. This was a very sophisticated, a well-planned operation with a lot of discipline. A lot of terrorist cells don't have that. I would venture to say that it is either Osama bin Laden and his group or some spin-off from it.
Senator, are you satisfied at this point with the intelligence on this operation? Should we have known about this? Is there any way on God's earth we could have known about it?
Well, that's the question. You know, if we didn't have any information, if we didn't have any inkling at all, then we've been hoodwinked. You know, we lost the day, and look at the results. But the intelligence community, all agencies, can do better than this if we put the resources behind it. But I think they're going to have to be much more aggressive. And we have great agencies. They've had a lot of good successes. But this was not a success. If it had been a success, it wouldn't happen.
Well, there is some question that perhaps the rules are too rigid now on who we can recruit for our human spies, as it were.
Well, I have advocated this, so is my colleague Senator Graham from Florida on the committee, that we've got to beef up. This has been going on 5 years that I chaired the committee. 5 years we've got to beef up the human intelligence. We've got to restructure NSA in a big way. There were people that wouldn't do that, said we don't need it. Today they know we need it.
Senator Shelby, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Well, Bob Schieffer interviewing, thank you, Bob, Senator Richard Shelby. And the senator, while saying he wasn't going to announce anything, clearly indicates that the briefing given to him is additional evidence that U.S. intelligence is pointing at Osama bin Laden and or at the very least what I think the senator called cells, terrorist cells associated with Osama bin Laden. So this is a significant development in terms of an indication of where the upper tiers of the U.S. government are going. It's one thing to talk about, well, maybe Saddam Hussein, maybe some state-sponsored terrorism, but the senator made it pretty clear that the indicators increasingly point to Osama bin Laden. We'll see what happens with that as time goes along. Now, bulletin from Washington, the FAA says airports will remain closed. We've had a little bit of this, a little bit of that, some indication maybe somewhere on the West Coast would ease up, but the FAA says airports to remain closed. They do not say when the airports will reopen. And so, Ed Bradley, this transportation emergency, again, trying not to use the word crisis, but transportation emergency will continue for at least another day.
We're not sure how long it will continue. And as I said before, I don't think that there will be a blanket reopening across the country. I think they will open up airport or section by section, one region of the country. Also, I might point out, Dan, that what else is closed is that we've got 50 U.S. missions around the world that have been closed down. The State Department says that there have been no specific threats, no direct threats against any embassy or any consulate. There are about 260 of them around the world, but they've left it up to the ambassador or the consul general to take action given their own specific security requirements. And I think about a quarter of those have been closed down as of now.
You know, Ed, increasingly over the last few years, I think this goes back 10 or 15 years, the State Department hasn't been able to get the funds from Congress to significantly upgrade security at most, if not all, U.S. embassies abroad. I wonder if that will change in the wake of what's happened here this week.
Dan, I think it will change. I think that there are a lot of things that will change as a result of what's happened here, particularly the funding for intelligence and for security at embassies, and I think for the FAA as well.
Ed, switching to something else, I have said repeatedly that it's pretty hard to imagine this operation not being very well financed and extremely well organized. I gather you have a different view of that.
You know, I don't think it takes a lot of money to do this, Dan. I think what you have to have is someone who had enough money to train half a dozen pilots, which is a significant amount of money, but not an extraordinary amount of money. They had to have enough money to get them either to Mexico or Canada to get them in this country. That's an airline ticket. That's not a lot of money. And they had to buy an OAG, an official airline guide, which you can get for a couple of dollars so that they can decide which planes they were going to take. I don't think that it takes a lot of money to do that.
Well, about this, you and I may disagree. My own sense is that there's got to be a daddy warbuck somewhere, and that somewhere might be in the Capitol.